Hi, everybody. This is Lowell, and we're discussing the subject of music theory and, in particular, harmony. And I wanted to, before I move forward into the rest of the discussion of harmony, to talk about um, how harmony is established, and particularly in Western music and in the Western ear. And in order to do that, I need to talk about the subject of the overtone series and tuning and equal temperament. And so we're going to end up talking about chromaticism and how chromaticism works, uh, and in further harmonic, basically what happened in the 1800s into the 1900s and early 20th century, how harmony became chromatic. Um, Essentially, Bach was, in my opinion, uh, the pivotal place in history that music changed. And it changed not necessarily because of his composing, although his composing utilized this change. But at that time in history, there was something that changed in terms of the type of systems that music had to work with, and that was the advent of equal temperament. And if without going into a huge scientific discussion about equal temperament, I wanted to show how that came about, and how and why that came about, um, and how it actually takes us back to today, in today's world, of where music history is going. And a lot of people don't realize, but I've done a fairly deep dive into the reasons that we should go back to the overtone series in terms of tuning. So when we talk about tuning and scales and so forth, and the premise that I've given in terms of understanding harmony is to, especially Bach's writing, to understand harmony from the standpoint of linear. And whenever you have a single line, that's not really necessarily harmony unless you create patterns in it that create harmony. But harmony is really created when you have two or more parts that are added together to, let's say, two or four melodies that are simultaneously going, that create counterpoint against each other. And then if you look at them from a vertical standpoint, you can see harmonic creation that come from the melodic linear writing. Nevertheless, it was never possible to really make that work as fully as Bach did with using chromatic lines. And we've talked about the difference between diatonic, which is a 7-note scale, versus chromatic, which is a 12-note scale. And the advent of bringing this new tuning system, equal temperament, into existence during Bach's lifetime, or slightly before his lifetime, that he really capitalized on, allowed him to move into chromaticism in a way that was not possible before. So what used to happen is, in pre-Bach, you had Renaissance composers and early Baroque composers that essentially would tune a harpsichord with essentially a tuning system that would work for a certain key. They would be in the key of D, and so they tune the instrument to where all the various aspects of the chords that work in D major would sound good in the key of D major. But then if the composer wanted to go, with that same tuning into another key, such as A flat, it would the tuning wouldn't work very well, and it would sound out of whack for the key of A flat. And so if the composer wanted to write in the key of A flat, then he would have to retune his harpsichord, go through the whole process of tuning every note in that instrument, all the keys of the keyboard. You have to retune it to the key of A flat to where it would sound good in A flat. And then if you wanted to modulate in that composition into the key of D, it would sound terrible in the key of D. And so, and I think I've talked about this earlier in this whole series of music theory. If you're a guitar player, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. It's like you want your guitar to sound really good in the key of E, but then you go into some other key, then it doesn't resonate quite as well. And that was the problem that they were having with creating music back in those days, until they came up with what is called equal temperament. In other words, it really was a compromised system where they would make the notes on a keyboard more equal distance from each other. And I'm not going to go into, the whole concept of how that works, but suffice it to say that each note was basically fudged a little bit one way or the other, to where it wouldn't sound as bad. It wouldn't sound bad at all, really. It was so infinitesimal, the capacity to change from one key to another, just by minor adjustments, making that possible, to where it didn't sound as bad. It didn't sound bad at all. It sounded like it all worked. And so to the modern ear, what we hear on the radio, everything that we hear in pop music, is all based on equal temperament. But this all started back in Bach's day, and he was one of the first to start really expanding chromaticism, so he could actually start in the key of D and go off and meander into some fairly far away key. And in the previous one of the previous videos here talking about harmony, I made the point that if you're in the key of C, the closest harmonic place to the key of C is either the key of F or the key of G, and that's because of the circle of fifths, and that goes back to the harmonic series. Understand the overtone series, and so which I'm going to talk about the overtone series here in a bit. But from the standpoint of using chromatic harmony, you could go around the circle of fifths much more easily, and it sounded fine using equal temperament. So what has happened now in terms of music history is that from Bach up through the early part of the 20th century, we had increasing chromaticism in our understanding of harmony. And so instead of staying pretty much centered around one key center, like if you started the piece in the key of D, you would maybe go to a dominant key or a subdominant key, or not too far away, but you would use some chromaticism to get there, and then you would always come back to the key of D. But later on, through the various stages of music history, you went from the Baroque period into the classical period, and Beethoven kind of spanned late classical period into early romantic period, and he started really expanding into a lot of chromaticism. And then people like Wagner and early Schoenberg started really and Richard Strauss started really pushing chromaticism in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, to be, maybe you would start in one key and you would end in another key, and where you really, the chromaticism was so rich and so diverse that tonal centers began to be challenged to where you didn't even know what key you really were in. And that led to the place where Schoenberg created essentially a new way of thinking about harmony or music organization in general, and that was that each note, each of the 12 notes, each of the 12 chromatic notes in the scale can be seen as its own tonal center. And so that when he developed that and brought that into music history, we call that atonal. He actually called it pantonal. He believed that each note was its own tonal center. So, and that led to a series of compositional techniques known as serialism, where you would create patterns of those 12 notes and use those in different ways. But essentially, when that happened, harmony started becoming less and less perceived by. We had gone basically as far away from tonality as we could from its origins, in pre-Bach eras. And so, in my estimation, the equal-temperament scale became. It was like a plant, just analogize it to a plant that grew. And so from Bach, it really started growing and producing, a beautiful plant and a beautiful flowering plant up into the late 1900s and early 20th century. Harmony was really lovely and utilizing this chromaticism, but once it crossed that line into atonal or pantonal or serialism, it really lost its foundation. And so, and of course, there are people that would disagree with what I'm saying, and there were people that composed in serialism, like Alban Berg, that wrote some really harmonically beautiful and chromatic works using the serialist technique. But as time went on into the later 20th century, serialism really seemed to walk away from any pinnings to an understanding of harmonic tonality. And so where we are now, well, let me say this before I say that. We moved into a place of even beyond the 12 notes of the scale. We moved into the experimentation of textural types of sounds, of not just notes but textures, and also of microtuning. And so microtonal writing from basically early 20th century into here now 100 years later, early 21st century, we're talking about trying to find the I guess any kind of system or something that's not totally devoid of harmony. And so what composers have done now is they've kind of merged and utilized all these different techniques of melodic writing, as well as harmonic writing, as well as serialism writing, as well as microtonal writing. But in my view, it's important for us in music history to actually go back and coalesce all of these various aspects of music history into a cohesive system. And I've written about this and talked about this in other videos, which I can post here in this video. But I believe that there's a way to integrate rhythm and harmony and melody and serialism and microtonality and textural, all in or ambient, all in one system, to where it's one scale and one way of bringing them all into cohesion as one system. And I believe that it could be as important as when Equal-temperament first came on the scene back in Bach's day. And I call this integrated frequency. And so without going into the whole, I'll post what I've, discovered about some of these things. But essentially, to understand the harmonic series or the overtone series, it happens around us in nature all over the place. And so you have a frequency, like the lowest frequency that for the human ear to hear is 20 hertz, or 20 vibrations per second. And so let's just take that that number 20, and so that's called the fundamental, and so that's your fundamental tone. And then the first, some people call that the first note, some people call that, you know, the octave, the first note. But let's just say 20 is multiplied by itself, and so that's, you know, 20 times 1 is 20, and then times 2 is going to be your octave, and that's 40, and then times 3 is 60, that's your fifth, and then times 4 is 80, that's your second octave, and then times 5 is 100, that's your third. And so now you've established essentially harmony, you've established your triad of the root, third, and fifth of the chord. And so you can take the harmonic series on and up, you know, 20 times whatever, forever. And so the higher the harmonic, the higher the nodes inside of that harmonic series, the intervals get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so there's a place up here in the higher harmonics that you actually have a chromatic scale, and it's all built upon the foundation of that first fundamental of 20 hertz. And so when you hear the fundamental being played by an instrument, then you're actually hearing all of those frequencies inside of that. So I believe that it's possible to use what I just said as the harmonic series as a jumping off point to integrate all of the different elements of music history into one cohesive system. So I'm not going to talk much more about all of that. What I'm going to talk about is just basic understanding of classical music theory, and essentially music theory that's understood in the late, you know, essentially Baroque, classical, and Romantic music styles, essentially, you know, going from you know, mid 1600s up to you know, mid 1800s. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about here in the next couple of videos. But suffice it to say, that system is essentially built on the overtone series because it's built on the circle of fifths, and the circle of fifths is built on the concept that that harmony functions by the fifth scale degree, or the third node of an overtone series. And so it's still based on the harmonic series. But that's a very comprehensive starting point for understanding harmony.